Hello, good afternoon, good morning, good afternoon, good morning, and good evening. Yeah, they're the three accepted greetings, apart from good night, of course. And this is that message is for people looking at this in the future. So before I confuse myself anymore, let's just go back into the present. I'm David Lindo, also known as the Urban Birder. This is In Conservation With, sponsored by Leica Sport Optics, as well as the Diputación de Cáceres, which is the tourism board looking after the northern province of Extremadura in southwest Spain. An amazing place for wildlife, and also a good place for our subject tonight, which is orchids. I think the first question I need to ask is, John, how are you and where are you?
I'm really good, David. Good evening. It's lovely to be back conservation with. I'm up in Shetland, so I am about as far north in Britain as it's possible to be. It was snowing outside the window this afternoon, so yeah, it's pretty wintry up here. I'd be in Extremadura.
Yeah, well, here, to be honest, in the evenings it's pretty nippy. I've got my heater on, and it's actually colder inside the buildings than it is outside, because as you probably know, in this part of the world, in the Mediterranean, the buildings are built for repelling the heat, and winter is not normally a long sort of period of time here in southwestern Spain. I was in Portugal last weekend, or this weekend has gone, expecting it to be absolutely brass monkeys, and it was 20 degrees. I mean, t-shirt weather. It's incredible for January, anyway, that's another subject, I'm pretty sure. We're here to talk about orchids, and it's, I think, the first In Conservation With, the first of over 120 interviews that we've actually changed the subject from animals and birds to plants. And this is my blind spot. I put my hands up straight away. I mean, I need to ask you the fundamental question: what the hell is an orchid?
Okay, an orchid is it's a flowering plant, obviously. They're one of the largest plant families in the world. There's 20-something thousand different species all around the world. The only continent they're not found on is Antarctica. And they have incredibly elaborate flowers, mainly to facilitate pollination. But to do that, they employ an incredible array of tricks and deceptions, far more than any other plant family. So we can explore that later, because there's some really cool stuff going on. Some of them are thieves. Some of them don't bother with chlorophyll. They are just amazing plants, and they've captured my imagination ever since I was a little boy. And yeah, that's what the attraction is. That's what an orchid is. It's the seed of an obsession.
And of course, the photo behind me, which looks like a piece of art, by the way, is one of yours.
Thank you.
It's one of yours, and it is an orchid.
It is.
What kind of
orchid
is it?
It's the lady's slipper orchid.
Right.
So it's one of the Cypripedium families, which have these incredible bulbous lips, and they're again, you get them in North America. Your guests in the US will be familiar with different species of Cypripedium, but in Britain we have that one species, and it came terribly close to extinction at one point, and then scientists at Kew learned how to propagate it, and they've been planting it out into its former range, and it's a slow burning conservation success story. They're starting to find a foothold again in the north of England.
Yeah, I'd like to talk to you about ladies' slippers later on, actually, because you devoted a whole chapter in the book that you've written, which is called Orchid Summer, published by Bloomsbury. There you go. And it's effectively a journey you took during the summer to try and see as many. I know you're not a lister. You're not a man that's going to be ticking off, and say, right, what's next? But you inadvertently you saw quite a lot of Britain and Ireland's orchid species. How many species are there I mean, in the world, and
Well, that's a
also
good.
in Britain and Ireland.
Well, okay, in the world, approximately 23,000, but there's new species being found all the time. And so that number keeps increasing. And as taxonomists look more closely and look at the genetics of orchids, it's a bit like birding. So we put you on familiar ground here, David. Sometimes there's splitters who are saying, that thing which you thought was one species, actually it's two or three. By the same token, there are lumpers as well who are looking at the DNA of these things and saying, I know those two look really different, but under the skin, under the hood, they're the same thing. So it's just, there's just as murky as bird taxonomy, orchid taxonomy. But in Britain and Ireland, it's an interesting question. When I set out, and I'm not a lister, but on this occasion, I did think, I think I can do this. I can see every species that occurs in Britain and Ireland in the course of one summer, or kind of spring, summer, and early autumn, in fact. And so at the time, I thought there was 52 species, give or take one or two. Since then, in the last 4 years, there's been 2 or 3 different species which have been found in Britain, which appear to be colonizing or pioneer plants, which seed may have blown across the channel from France. And these things are starting to find a foothold. And of course, with climate, the south of England is getting more clement. There aren't such hard winters. And so maybe these things will actually be able to survive. So it's a fluid number. It's just increasing, really. We've lost a couple of species, or at least one species. Summer ladies' tresses used to occur in the New Forest in sort of damp mires and bogs. That's gone. It was collected out, and also the habitat changed with drainage, and so we've lost that one. And the ghost orchid, the elusive phantom, which is seen every few decades in Britain, hasn't been seen since, I think, 2009 in the UK. It could be extinct. Then again, it might just be flowering somewhere that nobody's looking. It's very unobtrusive.
Was that plant actually named before people realised how difficult it was to actually find, or was it, once common in the Middle Ages or something?
I don't know. I think it's always been difficult. It's one of those ones which doesn't really have any chlorophyll, so that hence the name. Really, it's just 'cause it is like a wraith that grows out of the leaf litter in really dark woodlands. And so I think that it was more to do with its appearance. Having said that, never was a plant species more aptly named, because in Britain, it is so elusive. It's so hard to find. It's this slippery phantom.
Well, if you talk about dark woodlands, we haven't got many of those, and they're disappearing at an alarming rate anyway. So I can imagine its scarcity. Just out of interest, is that species also found in Europe, or is it? Are there any species, for example, that are just endemic to the British Isles and Ireland?
Well, yeah, again, yes and no. When I was doing my the ghost orchid, to answer your first question, yeah, it's actually found in not just in Europe but in Asia as well. You get ghost orchids in Japan, for example. So it's actually quite a widespread, never really common, but a widespread species. You get them in the Pyrenees on the Spanish side and on the French side. So they're close to you-ish, relatively. And they're sort of kind of at the edge of their range in Britain. But you get them much further north elsewhere in Europe. You get them up into Estonia, for example. And so I have a theory that there's really no reason why there might not be ghost orchids lurking unseen in some dark Scottish woodland, which nobody's ever been looking for them or stumbled across one at the right time of year in the right place. So, they really are easily overlooked. They're really tiny. Sometimes they don't even push through the leaf litter. They just flower underneath it. So it's a species which could go overlooked for years and years. But to answer the second bit of the question, do we have any endemic species? Well, kind of yes and no. When I was doing Orchid Summer, when I was traveling around, sort of the jewel in the crown in terms of endemism was something called Lindisfarne helleborine, which was found only on Lindisfarne or Holy Island off the coast of Northumberland. And that was pretty special. Since I did the journey, the taxonomists, like I was saying earlier, have been at it, and they've said, no, actually, it's just a subspecies of dune helleborine, which again, we thought we sort of kind of had a monopoly on that one, but it's subsequently been found in Ireland now. So, you know, these things are really fluid and plastic. They're, you know, the populations shift. Ireland does actually have one of its own. It has something called Irish marsh orchid, which is found there and nowhere else. So it's with orchids, nothing is ever completely straightforward and black and white and cut and dried.
Yeah, it's interesting with plants actually, because as I said right at the very top of this program, plants, you know, if I was to hold up one arm and that bicep was my knowledge of the animal kingdom, if I held up the other arm, it would be a noodle, you know, because it's
You look
nothing,
like
it's
me.
nothing. But what I do understand is that, you know, plants can be very easily overlooked, obviously. I mean, I remember 2 years ago, I was with someone walking up a hill in Extremadura, and I was panting and puffing because I think I got a bit of asthma. That was my excuse. Whereas she went right to the very top of the hill, and she found by the way, my internet's unstable, so if I cut out. Anyway, she found this plant. She took a picture of it. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can
Yeah,
you
you
hear
got
me?
very gurgly and then you've come back again. So fingers crossed.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Claire.
we missed that anecdote, David. Someone getting exhausted at the end.
I was
That's all
exhausted,
I heard.
and she sent me a picture of a flower. She was waiting for me for the top of the hill. She sent me a picture of a flower she was sitting next to, and it turned out to be a narcissus that was extremely rare in Extremadura. In fact, there was only, when I told my friend Martin Kelsey he was having kittens, he said, I've only ever seen that once before. And the next week, I took Martin and a couple of his clients up the hill, and of course, I had to become the man leading. So I ran up the hill, killed myself. But then when we went to the top, we found over 1,000 of these plants, which was absolutely incredible. Did you have such moments on your quest? Did you find more of what you expect of the plants that you thought you were going to see?
Yeah, sometimes, although slightly differently, actually. There's sometimes I bumped into things I wasn't expecting at all to see. And that was a bit like when you and I go out birding and, you know, it's autumn and you're walking around and suddenly up pops something rare in front of you. And you have that just moment of complete mind melting serendipity. It's so cool. You know, there's a rarity. There was a really nice moment when I was in the Hebrides on the island of North Uist. And there was an orchid there called Hebridean marsh orchid. So it's this incredible dark purple flower with these sort of black leaves. It's hardly got green on its leaves at all. They're kind of deep sort of purpley black color. And that's what I'd gone to see. And it's only found on North Uist. And I was wandering around that habitat, this maca, this sort of shell sand habitat, and it's just abounding with brilliant wildlife. You've got, you know, bumblebees flying past you all the time, corncrakes calling, you know, it's a brilliant place. And I'd seen my Hebridean marsh orchids, and I was, you know, just having a fantastic time being in the moment. And I glanced down, and there were a couple of orchids at my feet, and I thought, oh, they look a bit weird. So I, you know, went and looked a bit closer, and they turned out to be a really unusual hybrid. And this is something that orchids do a lot. They're really promiscuous. If they can, they'll cross-pollinate one another and create really funky-looking hybrid young. And these were the hybrid between Northern marsh orchid, which is a really sort of big royal purple looking sort of spike of a flower, and a really cool thing called frog orchid, which is this little green and burgundy colored flower. And they, with the best in the world, the flowers don't really look like frogs, but they're really unlike Northern marsh orchids. They look really different, but they create this wonderful hybrid very occasionally, which has these sort of yellow tones in the flowers. You know, it's a beautiful looking thing. And I knew what it was the moment I saw it. It was one of those classics, sort of a bit like when people, young birders sort of, you know, say they're seeing a Sabine's gull and you know they're seeing a young kittiwake. And you sort of say, when you see a Sab's gull, you'll know it. And it was like that when I saw these hybrids. You know, I knew in the moment, I'd never seen one before, but I knew just what I was looking at there. And I did a little happy dance, you know, I was there alone and just sort of capering around because this was this brilliant thing. So yeah, there were these sort of wonderful moments of serendipity and just chance discovery, which were fantastic. But I mean, you're absolutely right. The joy of planting I mean, never mind during the Orchid Summer Quest, you never know what you're going to find. And, you know, I go out birding a lot. Obviously, I live here in Shetland, but having the plants kind of in the back of your mind gives you something else to look for on a quiet day when, you know, the birds aren't performing. And during lockdown, of course, when, you know, we were all having to do our daily exercise close to home.
Most of us.
Yeah, I know, David, I know. It was, yeah, here I walked down the road, and this is kind of a story to my own detriment, because there's this really cool orchid called Lesser Twayblade. It's a tiny little thing. It grows in Britain, mostly in sort of heathery moorland, really hard to find. And I saw my Lesser Twayblades during my Orchid Summer up on the island of Unst in the very north of Shetland. And that was the only place in Shetland I've ever seen them. And during lockdown, I went out for a walk, and I went down to the little plantation at the end of the road, and I was looking for, it was early June, I was looking for redback shrikes and marsh warblers and stuff like that, really being quite optimistic because there weren't any. And as I left the plantation, feeling a bit dejected, I think, oh, I better go home now, I looked at this little sort of patch of moorland next to the plantation, and I actually said aloud to myself, oh, that really looks like it should have Lesser Twayblade on it. And I thought, I'll just have a quick wander. And the next thing I knew, I found a Lesser Twayblade, and then I found more and more and more. And I ended up counting over 500 Lesser Twayblades in that little patch of moorland, which makes it, well, I mean, they're probably all over Shetland, just going overlooked, but certainly one of the biggest known colonies of Lesser Twayblade, you know, in Shetland for sure. And that was 5 minutes walk from home, and I've lived here almost 20 years and never really looked hard enough to see them. So it just goes to show you can find them under your nose when you least expect it. And that's another really cool thing about orchids. They grow everywhere. I guarantee that people in the UK, certainly, and probably in America too, within a few miles of home, at some point in the year, there's probably an orchid that flowers of one sort or another. Might not be the rarest thing in the world, but there'll be an orchid. And I mean, that was a really cool moment for me. I mean, you're the urban birder. I was the urban botanist at one point in Orchid Summer, and I went into inner city Glasgow, and to be honest, a really socially deprived area of Glasgow. And there was this play park and sort of a community garden area, and they had these orchids, which they were incredibly proud of, growing there, these things called broad-leaved helleborins. And in fact, they actually grow everywhere in Glasgow. As you walk out the airport, they're growing out the gravel on the little roundabout outside Glasgow Airport. They grow from the cracks in the pavements. But it was really empowering to see these people just being completely inspired in an urban environment by the fact they've got rare orchids growing in their midst. So they really are everywhere. And I mean, even last year, they were found growing on a green roof in the middle of London, these things, tongue orchids. So you never know.
You know, I must say I'm very envious of people like you, because if there's one regret, or not even regret, if I can go back in time, and to the dawn of my interest in natural history, which was actually at that time total natural history, not so much plants, but certainly, you know, invertebrates, the whole lot. And I wished in many ways that I was able to be as rounded, you know, and notice everything. I mean, I see everything. I see plants, I see insects, and I'm thinking, but a bird, oh, no problem. Or even a mammal. I feel a little bit kind of blind. So it's really, you know, it's great talking to someone like you, you know, because I respect you not only as a birder, but as a botanist. Now, in your book, you spoke of in the past someone describing people having an interest in orchids, which is nothing I want to talk to you about, you know, because I meet people when I'm birding who are totally interested in orchids, you know, not roses or dandelions, it's orchids. But anyway, orchid delirium.
Totally missed that question, David.
Okay, am I back yet? Am I back?
You sound like you're back. Yes, yeah, you just got really garbled again.
Apologies, everyone, for the terrible internet. I was just saying that you made a reference to someone calling people interested in orchids, orchid delirium.
Hmm. So this relates to something in the 19th century when the British Empire was kind of at the height of its power for really for worse with hindsight. But of course, boats from all around the world were coming back to Britain with stuff that the empire was the British Empire was taking. So this isn't a very glorious aspect of our history at all. But there were naturalists going on a lot of these boats to different parts of the world, which hadn't really been explored. Certainly not from a natural history sort of recording perspective. And they started to find these incredible orchids. I mean, we've got brilliant orchids growing in Britain, but once you get to the neotropics, there's the diversity of everything, whether it's plants or birds, just explodes. And they found these incredible orchids there. And they used to send the plants back to Britain in these boats. Now, tons of them died because the long sea voyage is not really conducive conditions for orchids to grow. But they eventually worked out how to keep a lot of them alive, and they got them back to Britain, and they caused a sensation in the middle classes in Britain. Middle classes who were starting to have affluence and wealth, disposable affluence and wealth, and Britain being Britain, there was a very class sort of derived society. People wanted to show off to their peers, but also to people above and below them in the social strata. And having some beautiful orchids growing in your greenhouse was a way of sort of showing your wealth and your sophistication and so on. And it got to the point where some of these orchids were changing money for vast sums of money, changing hands for vast sums of money. And it became an absolute craze, a bit like a couple of centuries beforehand when the Dutch went crazy over tulips. That was tulipomania. Well, we had the same thing with orchids. It was orchid delirium. And there were, oh goodness me, there were all sorts of stories. There was a party of orchid hunters who went into the jungle somewhere in Southeast Asia. I think there were a dozen of them. And only one came out alive with some orchids. One had burnt to death in a terrible campfire at a tragedy. One had been killed by a tiger, and others were taken by disease. So these collectors suffered enormous hardships trying to fuel or to feed this sort of feeding frenzy that was existing back in Britain predominantly. And of course, this has a parallel actually with what we talked about a couple of months ago with the hummingbirds and their feathers being shipped back to Britain from the Americas. So it's just another inglorious chapter in our sort of consumption of the natural world. So it happened with birds, so it happened with plants as well.
I mean, as a layperson, I can understand at least some of the orchids I've seen. I can understand people's attraction to them because some of them look very, for example, the classic one's a bee orchid. For all my life, I've wondered what came first, the bee or the orchid? If the orchid came first, sorry, if the orchid came second, how could the orchid see what a bee looks like? That's always been a conundrum for me.
David, it gets madder than that though, because a similar one in the same family as the bee orchids, the Ophrys insect mimicking orchids. There's something called fly orchid, Ophrys insectivora. Now, it doesn't really look like a fly as such, but it clearly does look quite like an insect. It's got like a brown furry body. The sort of shiny bit on it that's known as the speculum looks like the reflected wings of an insect. So to a passing wasp, which is what is the orchid's trying to attract, there's the appearance of an insect down there. It's got some little fake antennae that stick out at the top of the flower. So physically, it clearly is mimicking an insect. And as you say, that's incredible that it's managed to evolve to do that. But the crazy bit of this is not only does it look like an insect, it actually releases a scent which mimics the pheromones released by a virgin wasp, an unmated wasp. These digger wasps, these male digger wasps, which are flying by, they get a whiff of this scent and they think, oh, well, hey, and fly down and try to mate with the flower, because they think, well, this is fantastic. It's, you know, got a lovely furry body and it's got shiny wings and antennae, and, you know, and it smells like one of my sort. And they grab hold of the flower and do something which is called pseudo copulation, and that is unsatisfying for the wasp as it sounds.
Okay, well, yes, and also they mimic, or they seem to mimic human body parts and whatnot.
Yeah, that's just I guess
Or
that's
is
just
that imagination gone wild?
yeah, that's us applying our imagination. This, the orchis orchids. There's some which are sort of anthropomorphic. They look like little human or humanoid figures. So you've got the man orchid, which, as you rightly say, you know, it has what appears to be a penis between its legs. The Spanish name for it, I forget it in Spanish to my shame, but you should look this up. You should ask your friends there. Translates as the hanged man orchid. And that's a much better name for it, because when you see a man orchid, each individual flower on it has its sort of head, like, you know, down at a terrible angle, as if it's just hanging on a noose. So that's a more accurate description. But there's also lady orchids and monkey orchids. And in Southern Europe, you've got one which leaves nothing to the imagination, which is called the naked man orchid, which is kind of pink and white and looks like a little naked bloke.
I mean, I've seen a couple of orchids. I mean, again, I'm not no expert, but I've seen orchids in Spain, in Extremadura, giant orchid. Is that the biggest one?
Yes. Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Himantoglossum robertianums. That's one of the first ones to flower. You'll be getting them any month or any week now. They should be coming pretty shortly. But we've been talking about a lot of sex. We've had plants, sort of bees trying to mate with orchids. We've had naked men in the flowers. But you know what orchid is derived from? The very word orchid is from the Greek orchis, which is testicle. And this is because the roots of a lot of these orchids, when the sort of the early naturalists were digging the plants up, they looked and just thought, wow, that looks like, you know, testicles. And this gave rise to the belief from right back in ancient Greece. Dioscorides, he wrote about orchids because they have testicle-shaped roots. They must be an aid to well, there must be an aphrodisiac. And so they had this reputation as being this really potent sort of love potion. If you were to take orchid roots and make a concoction from them, yeah, you'd be fine in bed. And this was a belief which carried right the way through the Middle Ages in Europe. It was, you know, that was the convention. Orchids were aphrodisiacs. And even now in the Eastern Mediterranean, in Turkey, there's a concoction made from dried and powdered orchid roots called salap, which makes a sort of hot drink. And the belief is still that is an aphrodisiac. So this belief has gone for thousands of years and persists. So all the incredibly sexy plants, and it's, you know, one of the things which is attractive to me as a writer and a naturalist. You know, there's colourful stories to tell about them.
Do you think we come on to the right moment to speak about lady slippers? Can you?
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
Am I live? Can you still hear me?
You're clearing, yeah, you're clearing. Yeah.
I was just asking, is this a good moment to slip into lady slippers?
Yeah, it's as good a time as any, I reckon. Yeah.
So you wrote a whole chapter on lady slippers. Can you explain for novices like me what a lady slipper looks like and why are they so special? Okay,
well, for everyone who's with us tonight, if you look behind David, that is the lady slipper orchid right there. Of all of the British orchids, they're kind of physically the most extravagant and dramatic looking of all the orchids. They are absolutely beautiful. They're not a shrinking violet, if I can use a botanical metaphor. they're not tiny little orchids like lots of orchids. You need to get a good bit of size on a lady's slipper orchid. So they're dramatic, they're striking looking things. Historically, they were only found in the sort of northwest of or north of England on limestone. And so they were always quite range restricted. But from a very early point, when people started to notice these things, when people, again, this is back to sort of a social change, when people started to have gardens and to have ornamental gardens, the first plants, you know, they wanted were things which you could get locally. And people, there was a booming trade in digging up ladies' slipper orchids, taking them down to the local market where traders would come and buy them, and they'd get shipped down to London to be planted in somebody's garden and invariably to die there, because a lot of orchids just will not transplant readily, because they often form a relationship with fungi in the soil, with mycorrhizal fungi, and these attach to the orchid's roots, and the orchid draws nutrients from the mycorrhizal fungi. So if you dig up a wild orchid and plonk it in your garden, chances are it's going to die. So that's going off on a bit of a sidetrack here, but you know, you hear about orchid theft even to this, you know, last year it was reported in the papers in Britain, you know, orchids are getting dug up by people. Well, people just shouldn't do that, not only because it's morally wrong to dig up wildflowers and it's in many cases illegal, but also because they're going to die anyway. So it's just, you know, not to be done. But of course, back then in the sort of 17th and 18th century, and going on into the 19th century as well, people didn't know that. They just knew that they could get a good price for ladies' slippers orchids at the local market. So they kept digging them up. And by the sort of the end of the 19th century, there really weren't any left. They were really hard to find. And local naturalists were bemoaning this and saying, you know, we've lost it, it's gone. And through the 20th century, in I think it was the 1930s or 40s, I forget, a local guy in Yorkshire found a lady's slipper flowering, and it was believed extinct, but he found one flowering. And a small secret society formed to protect this plant. So just a few people knew about it. And they kept it more or less secret right the way through into the 60s and the early 70s, at which point word kind of got around to Kew, to the Royal Horticultural Society, and people started to know about it. And in the 80s, they tried to propagate it because it was still just one plant. And every now and again, someone would dig some of it up. You know, people were still trying to steal it if they'd stumbled across it. But thank goodness, some of the plant's root was left behind on each occasion, and it kept going, it kept surviving. So the scientists then tried to propagate it, completely unsuccessfully, because with a lot of orchids, their seed is dust fine. And to actually germinate when you've got fertile seed, the seed needs to fall on soil which has the right mycorrhizal fungus in the soil, and the baby protocorm that forms when that seed hits the soil needs the fungus to help it to grow. So it's incredibly difficult to do this artificially, and the scientists just kept failing. And then there was this guy, an orchid enthusiast, a breeder in Sweden, a guy called Svante Malmgren, and he worked out how to get these Cypripedium orchids, the lady's slipper, to germinate. And it's just crazy sort of mad scientist stuff, this. He was using pineapple juice on agar gel. And apparently pineapple juice has got really complex amino acids and things in it. And this was helping the seeds to germinate. And he was having success. He was getting these things to germinate and to grow on into healthy plants. And so that sort of homemade technology, which he'd basically done in his kitchen, came back to London, and the scientists at Kew tried it with our native lady's slipper orchid, and it worked. And they started to grow lots of little lady's slippers orchids, which got planted out, and to this day still get planted out into sites in the north of England. And most of those sites are secret. One or two of them are now public knowledge, and people can go along and actually see these beautiful plants as they should growing in the wild. And some of those plants now are actually starting to naturally set seed in their own right. So as I say, it's a slow burning process, because orchids from the plant dropping a seed to it actually becoming a flowering plant takes years. It's not like an annual which just springs up the next year and flowers and everything's great. These things are slow burners.
Yeah, that's the next question I was going to ask you actually. How long does an orchid last for? I mean, obviously there's different species, but are they long lived in the plant world?
Well, it varies. There's a lady, to keep going with the lady slipper orchid, there's a lady slipper orchid in Estonia that's rumored to be 200 years old. Whether that, that's actually true or not, I don't know. But a lot of orchids, the way they work is they'll grow a new tuber every year, which gives them the energy to then put up a plant the following year to flower and so on. But that following year, they'll then be growing another new tuber down underground, and the previous year's tuber withers up and goes to nothing. So in theory, they can go on for a while, but some species, they'll flower for maybe 5 or 6 years, and then they just seem to exhaust themselves and go. But in that time, of course, they should be setting seed and creating more of their kind in the immediate surroundings.
Okay. So your search was in Britain and Ireland. I'm really interested in Ireland because Ireland hardly ever sort of features when people talk about these isles, including Ireland, if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So what's the orchid scene in Ireland like?
It's a really good place. What they've got is well, as I said to you earlier, there is one particular species that's unique to Ireland, the Irish marsh orchid. So they've got an endemic orchid, terrific. But what they've also got is some really wonderful habitat. There's an enormous area of limestone called the Burren, and it is massive. Anyone who's watched Father Ted, the comedy set out there, will be familiar with some of that landscape, because the early scenes in Father Ted, when the helicopter's flying over the landscape, that's the Burren. So there's these huge slabs of limestone laid across the landscape over entire hills. But when you actually walk across it, there's all these little cracks and crevices in the limestone where it's all shattered and eroded. And in all of those cracks, you've got amazing diversity of wildflowers growing, and amongst them you've got orchids as well. So it's a really interesting piece of habitat and really special. But what also it grows in that particular area in the Burren is something which is quite common in Europe, but found nowhere else in the British Isles, and that's something called dense flowered orchid. So that was another very good reason for me to go to Ireland to try and see this one particular species. You'll be hearing some noise in the background. I'm afraid my dog is now wandering around the kitchen while I'm talking to you.
I have noises in my background. I've got a dog yapping away, and I never had a dog here in the last 4 years, and suddenly there's a dog yapping now.
Yeah, this one might actually end up on my lap in a second. I'm afraid she's looking like she's going to jump.
We've had worse on this, don't worry.
Okay.
The Irish marsh orchid, where is that found? Is that sort of restricted range, or what sort of habitat do you find that in?
I saw my ones in, oh gosh, where was that? It was a little coastal town called Ballyheag. I'm probably not pronouncing that right, so I do apologise to Irish folk who are watching this, which is down on the southwest coast. So this was a kind of like a dune slack in a marshy area. I mean, there's a clue in the name. The marsh orchids, the diputación orchids, they're ones which like to have their feet wet. They like quite boggy areas. I'm not. It's a good question. I can't actually tell you the precise extent of the Irish marsh orchids range in Ireland, but certainly in Southwest Ireland, where I went to see them, there were thousands of them growing there in great profusion.
What are the sort of major threats to orchids, particularly in the UK and Ireland?
Oh my goodness!
Is it the classic scenarios of land? Change,
yeah, it's all of the usual bad things, I'm afraid. Land use, intensive agriculture has just taken away tons of habitat. It comes to a point where a lot of the best floral biodiversity in Britain is found on our road verges, because that's been spared the plough. But it's not just sort of the actual physical act of intensive agriculture, ploughing stuff up and planting monoculture crops. but you've also got the sort of the knock-on effect of a legacy of decades of use of insecticides, because the whole point of all wildflowers, but orchids in particular, is that they rely on insects to pollinate them. And many orchids have a very specific pollinator, which they've formed a close association with over millennia. And because our our invertebrate diversity has just crashed, as we know, you don't see the moths at night on your car windscreen when you go for a drive, stuff like that, the obvious stuff. But the sort of the hidden stuff, the solitary bees, the things which the orchids need, which aren't sort of big sexy moths and so on necessarily, although them too, all of that stuff's gone, or at least is massively reduced. And that, of course, has a knock-on effect on the ecology of orchids. They're going to struggle to prosper if there aren't enough pollinators. So it's all of that, but also climate change on a much sort of bigger level appears to be having some effects. For example, the ghost orchid we spoke about earlier. One of the reasons which people are putting forwards for its decline in southern Britain is wetter, beg your pardon, is the ground actually drying out underneath the orchid's feet from water abstraction. Of course, we're sucking aquifers dry, and the water table is dropping in certain places. So there's all sorts of pressures which seem to be mounting on orchids, but also all our wildflowers. It's not just them; they just happen to be very obvious and ones which caught my attention. But yeah, there's tons of less glamorous plants which are struggling too, for all the same reasons. Which is all
someone
all very depressing, isn't it?
Okay, let's lighten the mood a bit. Firstly, let me show everyone your lady slipper. Very nice. No, I mean, for someone watching this in the future or even now, how do you go about becoming an orchid watcher? What is there a specific time of year where these flowers are more prominent, or the plants are more prominent? How do you actually go looking for them? Is there a sort of a standard type of habitat? I know that the Irish marsh orchid, for example, has a specific kind of habitat, but is there a general place you can look for these kind of plants?
They do actually. This is one of the sort of the reasons why there's such a massive family of plants on a global level. There will be orchids which use almost every different habitat type. There's some which like old ancient meadows, but then again there's some which are happy in deep woodland. So the actual habitat type isn't necessarily totally important, although it is for certain specific species. But look anywhere and you should stand a chance of finding something if you're there at the right time. In terms of timing, the flowering season in Britain anyway starts late March, early April, and runs right the way through to August as a rule. So you've got quite a large window of opportunity. There's two organizations which can really help you if you're wanting to look for orchids and know where to go. The first one is the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland, which are known by the abbreviation of that. They're known as the BSBI. They're an absolutely fantastic organization, very active on social media, on Twitter, and they're really helpful. Every Sunday, under their umbrella, they do something called Wildflower Hour, and that is an account in its own right on Twitter, where if you've gone out, and it doesn't have to be orchids, it can be anything. If you've gone out and found a flower of any kind, you can just post a picture of that onto their Twitter account. And they've got a team of really friendly botanists who will instantly come back to you, or pretty instantly, with an identification of what you've got. And it's a really lovely, friendly community. It's not one of these awful judgmental sort of Facebooky type groups. They'll support you, and if you sort of if you ask where I find, I don't know, broadleaved helleborins, then people will actually come with suggestions. But also the wildlife trusts are really, really good. If you look at the Wildlife Trust website and have a look at their network of nature reserves all around Britain, almost every single nature reserve has got a dedicated page on their website. and you can just look there and it'll tell you what sort of things to look for, and including once you sort of start thinking, oh, I want to see orchids, and you look at your local nature reserves on the Wildlife Trust website, and sure enough, you'll find they'll say such and such a wood has got, I don't know, common spotted orchids or greater butterfly orchids. So it's a really good starting point. Start online, and you know, it doesn't cost a penny to look at those things, and that'll get you going. I mean, I really do encourage people to actually subscribe and join the BSBI, because they are an incredible organization which do an awful lot of good for conservation. They're a really powerful lobbying group as well for the greater good of the British environment.
Now, bird watching used to have, probably still has in a way, but used to have a real sort of bad image problem. Nowadays, you can even use it in a chat up line. You can even tell someone you're a birder now, and they will be really fascinated. Do you think botany is up there as well, or is there...
Botany is, of course, botany is really sexy. It's really cool, botany. It's far cooler than birding. I say that now. I mean, obviously, if I'm talking about birding, then birding's far cooler than botany. But no, botany is really cool, because, I mean, anyone who's been watching The Green Planet in the last few weeks, the wonderful Attenborough show on the BBC every Sunday night, you have to sort of realize that everything at a basic level depends on plants on this planet. We really need them. We need them to breathe. So do all the other mammals. And you know, it's incredibly important to be excited about plants. And yeah, there's it's not a fuddy-duddy hobby at all. And I mean, if anyone does read Orchid Summer, and please do buy the book, you'll realize that actually there are tons of really cool stories attached to plants. If anything more than I could find for hummingbirds. The orchids, there's tales of skullduggery, theft, you name it. It's all in there. All life is there. So yeah, plants are really cool. I don't know about using it as a chat up line, but you can try, David. Read Orchid Summer and have a go. Tell me how you...
I mean, look, I think about plants, and I'm just wondering, what do you think about, I mean, there's always been this thing about, oh, you're not allowed to pick plants and stuff like that, you know, because when we were kids, you just walk around a meadow and pick plants, and now there's this kind of social thing against it. Do you think that, what do you think about it? Do you think that by picking plants, it gets people interested and they kind of understand, you know, it's like a bit of a, you know, there's going to be some sort of collateral damage, of course, but then the long run result is the fact that people have a fascination. It's like with birds, you know, you look at people like, for example, Peter Scott. So Peter Scott, you know, he was
wildfowling.
It was a wildfowler. It killed geese, and then one day he had a turnaround. So what would you say, I mean, to budding young people, kids, you know, out in fields and stuff?
I have to fess up to something here, and it's a bit from the book. The first orchid I found was an early purple orchid, and I picked it. I was a little kid. In fact, somewhere, I was meaning to find it for tonight, somewhere in this house, in the pages of one of the books in my study. I've actually got it still, because I pressed it. And so I've got this sort of really sad, dried husk of an early purple orchid. Now, I mean, I didn't used to go around picking armfuls of wildflowers when I was a little kid, but at the time, you know, I picked it, and there was, you know, the sort of the obsession, the seed, the interest was born in that moment. So I think we have to be sort of not relaxed, but pragmatic about this, because if you're out with your kids and they're little and they pick some flowers, I don't think you give them hell for it. You sit and talk to them and explain that we really shouldn't be doing that. But, you know, I really don't think it's a big deal if a kid goes out and picks a handful of flowers. If it spurs an interest which lasts a lifetime, that's not a bad thing. If, on the other hand, I'm going out and picking a great big load of orchids to give to my girlfriend, you know, I'm an adult, I should know better than to do that. And so that's obviously wrong. So I think we have to be proportionate about it. If a kid picks some flowers, it's not a big deal. It's not.
The thing is, I think I'm singularly responsible for the decline of bumblebees, because when I was 5, I used to, when I was really so mad about all the invertebrates in my garden. I used to collect bumblebees, but I used to have an empty Coke bottle, and I used
Oh
to pick
man.
them up and stuff them into the bottle, and then I had a bottle filled with bumblebees,
Oh,
and
David.
then I'd pour them into a barrel to see if they could
Oh,
swim,
oh, David.
and they drowned,
Shocking.
all of them.
Funnily enough, yeah. Although I can't talk. I had a matchbox full of moss. I used to collect all the wood lice I could find in and put them in the matchbox. And that was my woodlouse zoo. And of course, a couple of days later, all the woodlice are dead. So yeah, just as little kids, we do stuff like that. I mean, you only have to read Chris Packham's memoir, Fingers in the Sparkle Jar, and he did some bad stuff to tadpoles in there. So we've all been there as kids. We've done some stuff which you look back and you cringe and wince, but it's not like you're going out there with a backpack full of insecticide and spraying them. It was just curiosity. Not so it's not such a big thing. Don't beat yourself up about the bumblebees.
Thank you, because I've been beating myself up all my life. I look embarrassingly at Twitter when I see reports of bumblebee numbers going down. I'm thinking, oh, I probably started all this.
Oh, David, if there is an afterlife and there's a big angry bumblebee waiting for you, we'll know.
So,
after all.
let me ask you. You've seen quite a few orchids, but is there the sort of super orchid that you'd like to see somewhere, in some remote jungle somewhere, or on an island somewhere?
Yeah, it's a bit like birds. There's always the one which you haven't seen yet is the one you want to see next. I mean, ghost orchid, spoiler alert, I didn't find the ghost orchid during Orchid Summer. But last year, when the travel restrictions eased, I managed to get out to France, and I saw my first ghost orchid in the Pyrenees, and it was just as good as I hoped it would be. It was fantastic to find my own like that. But I mean, yeah, there is somewhere I'd like to go and look for orchids. And it's a long way away, and I'll probably never do it. But Patagonia has some incredible terrestrial orchids, some really wonderful things. I would love to go and see those. They're flowering round about now in the sort of the southern hemisphere summer. So yeah, if I could teleport myself anywhere, I'd go to Patagonia and look for orchids there.
So have you answered my second question, which would be, if you could be anywhere on this planet, looking for orchids, where would it be?
I think I have actually. Yeah, that's where I'd be right now. I mean, in I should just say, oh my goodness, 5 or 6 weeks time, I will be going to look for orchids. I'm heading off to the island of Rhodes to lead an orchid photography holiday there. So I'm going to get to show people orchids and share my passion for both the plants, but also the photography there be there with a professional plant photographer, Sarah Cuttle. So if anyone wants to join us, you'd be very welcome.
Fantastic. Zoomers, just to let you know that on the 3rd of February, I can't believe that it's already February tomorrow. I mean, it makes no difference to people watching this in the future, but let me tell you now, at present, it is a shock. On the 3rd of February, next Thursday, we have Lev Perikian, who's been on before, and he's going to be talking about his book, which is called Light Rains Sometimes Falls. And it's effectively a look at Britain's seasons, but through the prism of the Japanese seasons, which I think is 72 in total. So that should be an interesting conversation. And we have more people coming. So keep your eye open, because we have a lot of people coming up over the next few weeks and months. So please bear with us. I'm sure that there'll be something just as interesting as tonight. So keep an eye out. I have to say at this stage, John, that once again, it's been a complete and utter pleasure having you here. And I'm really sorry that I kept on breaking up because I'm a bit unstable tonight. But thank you so much.
Sorry, Dave. I was going to say thank you ever so much for having me on again. It's always a pleasure to come and chat with you.
Well, thank you. It's mutual. And Zoomers, once again, thank you very much for joining us tonight, this afternoon, to talk about orchids. And all I want to say is take care of yourselves, look down for orchids.
That's right. Thank you, David.
Yeah, look down, but also keep looking up.